So I want to say welcome, everybody. My name is Kim Driscoll, and I'm the New Brunswick Adoption Support Network Coordinator for Central New Brunswick and the Miramichi area. I want to let you know a little bit about the foundation before I hand you over to our expert, Shawn Smith, tonight. New Brunswick Adoptions Foundation main mission is to promote and facilitate through our advocacy the adoption of children and youth in the permanent care of the province of New Brunswick, while we encourage partnerships with other organizations that share similar objectives and goals. And the way we do this is by hosting webinars, by providing many different avenues of support through our support groups, our Adopt Talks, our Late Night Talks with Kim, our High Needs group. We have regional support groups. We have such an array of resources that we can offer you. If you're not sure who your coordinator is for your area, please feel free to contact us or visit our website at www.nbadoption.ca. Without any further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Shawn Smith, and he can do his own introduction. I will state to you that it is about an hour and a half long. We ask that you stay on mute unless you are speaking, so that Shawn can have the platform and be able to give his information to us. I also ask that if you have a question, at the bottom of your screen, you're going to see that you have options where you can put up your hand. So either you can have the hand signal on your screen, or you can write in chat. We really love interaction. And Shawn tonight has told me that he is going to love the questions, bring them on. If he's presenting a slide, our staff are in the background with our AV techs, and they're going to watch for these questions. And you don't have to wait till the very end, although Shawn is going to have a question and answer period at the end. So no worries if you didn't write it down in your chat. We're going to get to you at the end, okay? I also want to make sure that everyone knows that this is live and it is recorded, and that unfortunately my internet isn't working properly, so I am on my phone. I apologize for probably looking in such a small little space. And if you don't see me at the end, it's because my internet gave out. But rest assured, you're in great hands. We have Catherine Derry, our coordinator from St. John, and we also have Mindy, our coordinator for up north. So Shawn, it's all yours, and thank you for coming tonight.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate all the work that you all do. This is an important topic, and one that's near and dear to my heart. I work with a lot of different folks and families through social development, and it's very rewarding. So thank you for all the work that you do, because I know that it's a lot of work. But it's also very rewarding. So I'm Shawn Smith. I'm the founder of Don't Diss My Ability. I am a counselor and psychotherapist by trade, and I specialize in the emerging field of neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is a relatively new term in the world of psychology that represents a group of individuals with a disability label, but for whom the term disabled doesn't quite fit because our assets exceed any deficits we experience. And so I'm unique in the way that I self-identify as having ADHD, and I specialize in this particular field. I'm also autistic, but tonight I'll be focusing more on the ADHD side of things, and I'll be sharing my story and then kind of going into some of the points that Kim asked me to bring up during the webinar. And so I was diagnosed with ADHD and attentive type at the age of 30. Prior to my diagnosis, it took me 4 years to finish 3 years of high school, 32 attempts to earn the 18 credits required to graduate, including failing grade 10 math 4 times. If you'd asked my parents which one of me or my siblings would have gone on to post-secondary, it would have been my brother, my sister, the cat, the dog, and then me. My parents are, they have their own business, they're self-employed, and they actually built a branch with thinking, like, what the heck are we going to do with Shawn? It was, when people ask me what life was like, I describe it as hell. I felt like I was wrongfully imprisoned in my own brain and in my own thoughts. And so a lot of the experiences that I share with people, what makes me a parenting expert isn't the professional experience that I have, which that's part of it, but also understanding all the things that my parents tried, why they didn't work, and the aftermath and the anguish that it caused me and us as a family. I started playing football my first year of grade 12. I played hockey and golf all my life. I never got any better. I just got bigger. And so my first year, grade 12, I started playing football. By my second year, I was an all-star. I got recruited by every major Canadian university with a football team. And it was such a high and then such a low because I didn't meet the academic requirements to attend any of these schools. I got snuck into a college in Quebec at Cégep. The head registrar was also the defensive coordinator, and they took a chance on me and they stuck me in. It took me 3 years to finish a 2-year program, but I did it. Oddly enough, I was more successful in college than I was living under my parents' roof in high school. After I graduated from college, I came back home, went to STU, earned a Bachelor of Arts degree with a whopping 2.3 GPA. I had a ton of life experience and then was diagnosed at the ripe age of 30. Prescribed medication basically gave my brain the jump start it needed to wake from a 30-year slumber. It literally took my thought process from dial-up to fiber op. My role is not necessarily to promote medication, but I do share what it has done for me. And so I went back to upgrade as a mature student, taking 5 courses with a new GPA of 3.7. And so I went from a 2.3 to a 3.7, which is a pretty dramatic difference. In 2010, I was accepted to the Master's of Education and Counseling Psych program at UNB on academic probation and graduated a year later at the top of my class. Because I've had all these different experiences, I have unique lenses through which to help people. I've had 22 different jobs. I've literally done everything from shovel crap as a landscaper to work at A&W, McDonald's. I was also a head doorman at Sweetwater's for a few years. If I look familiar, some of you recognize me from there. I was also a blackjack dealer in Lake Tahoe. For a summer, I was a therapeutic foster parent for at-risk youth in the state of Maine for a year and a half. I was a sheriff's officer here in Fredericton. I worked 2 murder trials. I worked in the Northwest Territories twice at a residential treatment facility for at-risk youth. So I've had all these experiences, right? And I've worked for community living as an independent facilitator, writing proposals to keep individuals with disabilities out of institutions and promote independence so that they could be in their own homes. And I also worked as a transition facilitator, working with students with disabilities to help them prepare for the working world or post-secondary after high school. So a lot of different experiences to help people. And I really look at ADHD differently. And so I recognize that I have unique gifts that come by way of having ADHD. And so in my practice, traditional counseling and psychotherapy focuses on perceived deficits with a person. Everyone else has tried that, it doesn't work. So when I meet with someone and they disclose that they have ADHD, the first thing I say is, welcome to the world of the uniquely gifted. And I'll talk to them about, what are the things that you're passionate about? What are the things that you really enjoy doing? And then I try to lean into those things. I'll share a couple of quick success stories. I have one young man who's on the spectrum, also has ADHD, he's a ward of the province. And when I first started working with mom, I asked her, does your son have any identified gifts? And she said, well, he really likes to color and draw. And so at the time, I think he was probably 14 or 15. And so I had mom bring everything in. And I always try to think low risk, maximum reward. Who do I know in my network who can really look at this and tell me, what the value is? And so I contacted an acquaintance of mine who's going with a publishing company. Long story short, this young man is going to be a published author by the end of the summer. So, here we have this young man who, complex case, might have been in school for an hour a week, and he's going to be a published author of a child's book. When, I have clients who are interested in acting or voiceover work, I connect them to someone in my network, Adam Seitz, who has done voiceover work on Grand Theft Auto, Go Diego Go, Dora the Explorer. He's Mr. Potato Head in the Ruffles commercials. And so my network has just grown so much that I really enjoy connecting these kids with people in a particular niche area where they feel like they might want to explore, but maybe they don't have the confidence to. So to connect them with someone who really can give them a sense of hope. Because we will tell kids, you can do anything you want, right? Every kid is born an artist until some adult convinces them later that they're not, right? So it's really important for us to kind of hone in and fuel these kids' passions. So with that, I'll get started on my PowerPoint. And so really today, I called it Exploring and Celebrating ADHD. one of the challenges for me is actually being in New Brunswick. I'm sought after and recognized more for my work outside of Canada than I am in my own home province and country. And so in New Brunswick in particular, we have this deficit-based mindset around disability. When we think of someone with a disability, we automatically think of the things that they can't do. Whereas in the States, they're very much more progressive. And just to give you a quick example, I have the opportunity to speak in the States. I'm part of a 5-year project with the University of Connecticut, $2.5 million budget, where they're actively looking to recruit and retain neurodivergent students for their engineering program because they know that these kids are going to be the future of engineering. And so they're really flipping things upside down. They know that these kids have gifts, but they also have challenges. And so some of the challenges that they have are how they process information. And so with this particular project, the students are able to approach the prof, and if they're able to come up with a project that utilizes their unique gifts and demonstrates that they have an understanding of the knowledge that they've acquired, that's what they can do for an exam or a test. And so they also look at how the information is relayed to students. So for a lot of students who are struggling in school, it's kind of a misnomer. It's not that the students are struggling in school, it's that the school is struggling to reach the students, right? So when I talked about being a blackjack dealer, I actually learned how to count and do mental math at the age of 24. Before that time, I was still undiagnosed. I wouldn't play board games. I wouldn't play card games because I could never remember the rules, and I didn't want to be made to feel like a dummy because I would be embarrassed. And so when I went to Lake Tahoe, I didn't want to be a blackjack dealer, but I got pushed into that job, and they taught me how to chunk things up. And because I had something tactile to manipulate, I could then do it in my head, but I couldn't do it the other way around. So that's what really got me thinking about how is it that all of these teachers that I had growing up and all these math tutors couldn't teach me how to do mental math, but a pit boss with no formal education in teaching could, right? So my mantra for my company is don't diss my ability. I may not learn in a conventional manner, but that doesn't mean I can't learn, only that you've not been able to reach me. And so that's part of the bigger picture. And it's something that can be a bit of a frustrating process. Like I'll have a lot of parents send me their kids' homework because there's too much information, right? It needs to be broken down, chunked up, and given to them in a very specific way. And there's a lot of talk about universal design. I'm sure most people have seen the movie Elf, where Buddy runs into the coffee shop and it's the world's best cup of coffee, and then he tries it and he spits it out. Not the world's best cup of coffee. Well, just because we name something a certain title, doesn't make it so. And universal design is one of those things, right? It's just because somebody calls it universal design doesn't make it universal. So it's a challenge. So I'll go through the slides. Oops. So I'll go back to this. I'm a psychotherapist and Canadian certified counselor through the Canadian and Counseling and Psychotherapy Association. I'm also a licensed counseling therapist through the College of Canadian College of Counseling Therapists of New Brunswick. And you can find me on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. I like to tell people the only way you can't find me is if you live under a rock. I'm pretty much everywhere. And so there are 3 types of ADHD. Most people aren't really aware of this. There used to be ADD. And so now ADD is a term that's not really used. There's just 3 types of ADHD. And so the first type literally is type A. And this is a kid who can't sit still. They constantly need to be moving, boundless energy, goes to bed late, typically gets up early. Things that these kids hear a lot are, can you please sit still? Why do you do that? I wish you didn't have so much energy. And so what's really challenging is that these kids need a lot of, I don't want to say necessarily attention, but they need to be stimulated. They need to be kept busy. And when they're not kept busy, sometimes they'll get into trouble. And it's not so much a reflection of the kid as it is the environment of needing to keep them busy and stimulated. It's when we're not keeping them busy and stimulated that they might get into things that they shouldn't. And that can be a challenge. Type B is the type that used to be known as ADD. And so type B is the inattentive type. This is the kid that looks like they're daydreaming, constantly misplacing things, go to bed early and wake up late. Things that we typically would tell these kids, pay attention, focus, how many water bottles can one person lose, and I wish you would try harder. And so these are the types of messages that these kids get. The challenge is that it's not that these kids can't focus. It's not that they aren't necessarily focusing. It's that when there's all of these things happening, they have to try and choose what to focus on. And they will typically focus on the most exciting thing or the most contextual relevant thing to them. And so it gets really challenging, because when we say things like, I wish you'd try harder, it has nothing to do with lack of effort. It really doesn't. There's, when they get into something, they can really get into it and they can rock it. But again, it's, you know, I'll tell people, if you want my attention, you've got about 10 seconds to grab it. After that, I'm gone. I've checked out. So just because someone's there, you know, and they're speaking, doesn't mean that they've earned our attention. And this is kind of a challenge with school, right? Because school takes an authoritative standpoint of, you need to listen when I talk to you. You need to do what I say. We don't do well with that. We don't do well with authoritative types of parenting or teaching. There's kind of a generational thing that happened where, you know, when I was growing up, it was, you know, kids were seen and not heard. It was all about respect or disrespect, and the sense of, you know, parents feeling disrespected and how dare their kids do this. Well, the kids, from their perspective, they're not trying to be disrespectful. They're just being themselves. And so a lot of it has to do with us in these ways that we were kind of conditioned as kids and trying to use that as parents. Every generation of parents vows to do something different than the last. Our parents' generation was a little too heavy-handed. And so the next generation that came in was kind of the friend parent. And so there was the absence of, you know, types of consequences and parenting, really. And then there's the type C, which is the combined type, very impulsive, frequently get into trouble, starting at an early age. Things we would tell these kids, unfortunately, why can't you be more like your siblings? These kids get compared to a lot of other kids quite often, which is very unfortunate. And so the term, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder implies that we have difficulty paying attention. That's not true. The challenge is that we're paying attention to every little thing. And so it's hard to decide where attention should go. We often get bored and retreat into our own thoughts. That is especially true for the kids with type B, the inattentive type. We'll often retreat into our own heads. And so it's kind of a weird situation because, you know, it seems like we're daydreaming. And so when someone's trying to get our attention, we're in our own world. And so when someone says our name, they continuously need to say it louder to try and get our attention. But the problem is it's not really an effective way to communicate, because once your voice gets to a certain decibel, it's hard to distinguish whether or not it's a happy yell or an angry yell. So once your voice gets to a certain point, you kind of scared this kid out of their bubble that they're in. And so then they become reactive. And so they might talk back in a sassy tone. And it's not necessarily that they're trying to be sassy. They're just reacting to your voice, which was a certain decibel, which may have sounded like you were angry or cranky at them. So there are different ways to get a diagnosis. You can get in touch with a pediatrician, a licensed psychologist who provides psychoeducational assessments. You can meet with your family doctor. Family doctors, from my experience, are typically hesitant to diagnose. They will often refer to specialists in a particular area. Right now, it is quite challenging to get a diagnosis because of the extreme wait list for psychologists now. Getting assessed kind of went the way of cars and lumber. Once the pandemic hit, everybody was trying to access them, and the same thing happened with psychologists. So now there's significant wait lists to get in touch with a psychologist. So when people contact me and they ask me the different ways to get assessed, depending on what city you're in, like my advice has been, you know, call a few psychologists in different cities and go with the first person who calls you. That's really, I mean, the assessments that they're going to use are all the same. It's just the person facilitating it is going to be slightly different. When you go through the assessment process, depending on, if you're going, well, one of the tips that I tell people is that ask if they've charged by the hour or by the assessment. If they charge by the hour, you're going to pay $500 to $1,000 more. So it's much more feasible financially to have it done by the assessment. Now, if your kids are young, then one resource that I like to share with people is the Psychological Wellness Center at UNB. They are PhD candidates in their psychology program who provide assessments at a fraction of the cost. They do have a wait list. The number of clients that they can take on depends on the amount of students that they have. The Psychological Wellness Center, they are hands down the best reports I've ever read. And I have experience on both sides. So I've had 3 psychoeducational assessments done personally. And then I also learned how to perform some of the assessment tools when I took my master's degree. And so I always try to, give a few words of encouragement for parents that, when you're going through this process, a lot of it, like deficits are, unfortunately, they're deficit based. And so when we're looking for what these kids do wrong, how do we ever find what they do right? And so when I get a educational assessment from a parent, I kind of skip over a lot of it. I look for the thing that didn't get touched because it's all based on perceived deficits. So it's a bit of a challenge. And I also try to get people to think about, like, I don't really work with a lot of psychologists. Part of my problem is that sometimes I know too much. Having worked with a lot of them and having worked on the front line myself, a lot of the recommendations that they put on paper, they've never actually had to implement. And so it gets to be a challenge because parents will go through these recommendations. They think, okay, if I try this, this is going to be the thing that works. And a lot of times it's not. So I usually tell parents that, if someone says that they have the answer, that should be a red flag. I tell people, I don't have answers. I have perspectives to share. People will take away what they will. So in what I'm sharing here, like, this isn't, I kind of call this more of a guide, because it's for a lot of things that I suggest, I really want people to think about them, take them, make them theirs, and tweak them. There's not going to be one thing that's going to work for everybody. So it's important to kind of take notes, think of ways that you can make some of these suggestions yours, and run with it. I also recommend that when you go through the assessment process, one of the last meeting that you have with the psychologist when you go that route is to go through a debriefing where they explain the results of the assessment. This is an overwhelming process. Parents are already overwhelmed. They feel like they're going in a way they're receiving bad news. There's a lot of language and jargon that they're not familiar with. It's hard to make heads or tails of what it actually says. So it's good to kind of take notes, go in with pre-written questions that you have. That way, when you go in, you're sure to ask all the questions that you had. If you don't write them down and you go in, you're likely to forget something and feel anxious afterwards for forgetting to ask that one question. So I usually encourage people to bring questions with you. Sorry, I just got distracted by the chat. To bring paper with you and questions ahead of time. I really try to promote fidgets. They're a great way to keep the kids' hands busy. And the saying really is, busy the hands, free the mind. Some kids need help to keep their bodies moving, and I encourage people to give them the space to do this. Fidgets can be a bit of a challenge. I know, like, the fidget spinners were all the rage. Fidget spinners, the therapeutic ones, shouldn't make any sound. And so what happened was they went mainstream. Everybody started making them and making different versions of them. And now they're essentially banned from schools because all you could hear was this buzzing sound and teachers getting annoyed with them. So unfortunately, the fake knockoff ones ruined it for everybody else. But really it is to try and keep the hands busy, to free the mind, whatever that may be. If it's Lego, it can be all kinds of things. If you have a child that is really destructive and they go through a lot of things, then I try to encourage parents to, like, set up an environment where that's okay. Give them the old newspapers to rip through. Maybe there's a way to turn that into a business where they can sell that to people who have pets for their cage liners, or maybe they can start a recycling business where they shred paper for different businesses. I always try to think of the positive aspect of whatever the behavior is. One really important point is effective communication. In order to communicate effectively, we need to try and make sure that we reduce the number of external stimuli. So if you want to have a conversation with the person with ADHD, and the TV's on, the radio's on, if there are multiple conversations happening, if you think in that moment that kid is listening to you, I'm here to tell you that you're wrong. They will say yes, they'll nod, okay. You may even ask them to repeat what you just said, and they may be able to do that. The second you turn around, that thought is gone. So it's important to set up the environment that is conducive to effective communication. And once you know this, it's up to you to help facilitate that. And there'll be times when you catch yourself and you'll kick yourself in the butt, because you'll recognize that, like, okay, I was just talking to them, they agreed to do this. And then you walk away 5 minutes later, they're still on their device or playing their video game. That's not on them. It's on us as parents. So we have to make sure that we kind of set the tone for communication. So folks who are neurodivergent, we thrive on three things: structure, consistency, and routine. And I try to get people to think of it like a tripod with three legs. When one of the legs gets kicked over, what happens? The other two come crashing down. And so there are different ways to set up structure, consistency, and routine. And I'm old school. I take it back to how things used to be. So have a family meeting every week, preferably in the same room, same day, and the same time. Set up ground rules for the group. Have a conversation amongst yourselves, see what things should be rules to help things run smoothly. So, like no interrupting, taking turns, all that kind of stuff, being respectful, no name calling, all that stuff. And so what it does is it helps to ground kids. It gives them something to look forward to. And I think there's another part that we'll get to in a little bit around food. And so part of that, the structure, consistency, and routine, like whenever there are breaks in, so March break, Christmas break, to come up with a bucket list so that kids have something to look forward to. Because of how our minds work, we're kind of constantly thinking about the future. And if we don't have something to look forward to, it's hard to ground us. So I really encourage people to come up with a summer bucket list so that everybody feels heard. It gives kids a voice in an area where they otherwise feel like they may not have a voice. I also try to get parents to think of a scale. From the time these kids wake up until the time they go to bed, how much of their day consists of being told that what they're doing is wrong compared to what they're doing is right by the people who are closest to them, the people who should offer and provide the most love and support. So I really get people to think of it like a Libra scale. And it's, I had this epiphany when a mom called me a few years ago, and she had 3 kids, and she called me, she just started crying, and I cried right along with her. She said, the oldest picks on the middle picks on the youngest picks on the dog. I don't excuse the behavior, but I understand that there's a pecking order. And mom said, my youngest daughter is starting to isolate more, and it just kind of dawned on me. And I just said to her very bluntly, like, if you were your daughter, would you want to spend time with you? And she just started crying, and she realized that because she was so negative all the time, telling her daughter to stop doing this, stop doing that, she said, no, I wouldn't. I said, okay, so it's probably not a huge surprise that she's isolated. So how are you going to engage her? And that's really what it comes down to, is trying to engage the kids. We spend so much of our time trying to get people to fit into our world that we rarely explore how we can fit into theirs. And this is kind of like my secret sauce, is like trying to figure out what the person is interested in, and then how do I relate to that contextually. So once I find out what they're interested in, I use that as the context for communication and education. There's so much that we can tap into by kind of getting to their level and talking about the things that they're interested in. Because a lot of times they're not going to listen to us. For when you're talking to someone with ADHD, You have a 10 to 15-second window to say what you need to say before their thought process starts to go somewhere else. So it really does help to keep them engaged. And when I talk about the effective communication piece, like even when all the external stimuli are kind of at a lull, or even when they're not, something as simple as making light contact with them so that they know that you're there helps to kind of get their attention. So it might just be like putting your hand on their shoulder, or just something gentle so that you don't scare them, but let them know that you're there. That's another way to kind of draw them to you, to ground them, to get them out of their head and kind of back into the here and now. When it comes to the neurodivergent people, I really try to get people to think of 3 ages. We have our physical age, which is the age that we are. We have our emotional age and our intellectual age. Now, one of the biggest challenges for neurodivergent folks, and this is something I encounter every day in my practice, is that parents will often want kids to play with their peers. Well, peers aren't necessarily kids who are their same physical age. And so kids who are neurodivergent often will prefer to spend time with people who are younger than them or people who are older. People who are their own age are kind of wild cards. They haven't figured out who they are yet. So it's hard for these kids to kind of get a sense of who they're spending time with. When you have kids who prefer to spend time with kids who are younger than them, I really try to promote that as much as possible, because these kids are dependent on the adults in their life for so much that it flips the script. And now we've got this younger kid who's now all of a sudden dependent on the kid with ADHD. And that's a good feeling to have. We should all want to have that feeling, right? So the more we can try and encourage that, the better. I try to get people to think of it as kind of like an aura of energy. For kids who are their own age, the aura is really hard to see through. Because those kids haven't really figured out who they are yet, it's hard for these kids to kind of figure out where they fit in within their world. Where we really need to try and connect with these kids is more closely to their emotional age. And when I say intellectual age, it's not necessarily about where they are educationally. Like I've had kids that I worked with before who, they might not change themselves or do chores or their own dishes and have some pretty extreme behavioral issues, but they could take a computer apart and put it back together. So it's not always indicative of somebody's academic performance. And kids who are neurodiverse also have heightened senses, typically at least one. So with sight, they can be sensitive to light, smell, sensitive to certain smells, taste, sensitive palate. Certain sounds can cause physical pain, and touch, sensitive to different types of materials. So I'll give a couple of examples. Taste, it could be the texture of a food. It could be the color. There could be a lot of things. I actually had a client one time who, when I first started meeting with her, she said mom would describe her as somebody who was a fussy eater. And so I always try to think like, okay, how do we flip this upside down? When I explored this with her a little bit more, she told me that she could actually taste the chemicals in canned soup, like anything that was processed. She could taste the chemicals in store-bought bread, in milk. And so I flipped it around. And so, it wasn't so much that she was a fussy eater, but she had a really unique palate. And so we stopped working together. But one of the things that I was digging into is that Ben and Jerry's and Tim Hortons, Starbucks, they all have positions called flavor gurus, where they're looking for someone who has a certain type of palate. So again, it's looking at it from using a positive psychology lens, where mom and most people would look at her as a fussy eater and trying to figure out the things that she can eat. I'm trying to flip it upside down and say, okay, let's look at this as an asset. And then I think of, okay, who do I know in my network who can really help me assess this? And so I got in touch with a friend of mine who's a chef, and he said, Shawn, yeah, you're definitely onto something. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to see that through with the young lady, but that's the type of thought process that I go through. Hearing is kind of a mixed bag. So there's a screech that my son will make that will like cause me physical pain. And it's really, really hard to deal with. Now there's the other part of that where kids may have a heightened sense of hearing. So You could be in the opposite end of the house and they can still hear you. So sometimes you have to be mindful of that. And I have quite a few clients who it's a challenge, because if they're having a session with me and their child's in the house, the child may be able to hear everything that we're talking about, and that's not good for anybody, right? This is supposed to be a safe space for the parent to kind of vent and talk about what's going on, maybe to develop strategies on all these things. It's not really fair for the kid to have to listen to that. So that's one thing to be aware of. Kids will often, when they get home from school, a lot of times they might be really tired or really excited. They're processing their day. So a lot of times kids are overstimulated. And when they get home, they may not really know what to do with themselves. So having a structured activity after school can help. A lot of parents will think, oh, my son or daughter needs time to unwind, and so they go on their device. In my experience, it doesn't always help them to unwind. Sometimes they actually get more wound up. And so one of the reasons for this is that when we're on our devices, we actually press pause on our brain's ability to process information. And so the longer that a kid is on this device and they press pause, when we have to tell them to get off, all of a sudden, all these things that they haven't had to process come flooding to the forefront, and it's an overwhelming feeling. They get so distracted by what they're doing that, they may not use the bathroom until it's like, absolutely a necessity. They'll get hungry or hangry. And so you're trying to have a conversation with them. They're so wrapped up in their game that they forgot to eat. And so they may lash out and say things that they may not mean, which is unfortunate, and takes me to my next slide of the 3 states of mind. And so where we want to be is in the middle, in wise mind. When I use the example of emotional, I like to use a positive example. So I know Kim's here. So if I said, Kim, if we were at my office and we checked my wallet and I had a lottery ticket, I said, let's go over to the Irving check. And I win $10 million. Yes. And I say, Kim, I'm going to give you half. Is that a good decision for me?
It'd be a good one for me.
Good one for you, not so good for me, right? So it's an emotionally charged decision. And so the problem with that is that when we as people, not just me or you, Kim, but people in general, when we get too far over into emotional, we are at our dumbest. We will say and do things that we don't necessarily mean. And so this is something to be mindful for us as parents when we start to get upset, but also to be mindful of with our kids. When they're enraged, they're going to say things that they might not normally say. And if they're really enraged, it can be problematic later because they may have said something that really hurt you. And then when you go to address that later, when things are calmed down, they might not even remember saying it. So then that becomes a whole other issue. So we have to kind of get out of this mindset of winning. It's not about winning and being right. It's about trying to communicate effectively. And so it's a bit of a shift in the dynamic, because we've always kind of been, as the grownups, as the adults, we're supposed to be right. It's not about being right. It's about practicing unconditional positive regard for these kids, even when they hate us. Sorry, did somebody want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to ask you, since you're on this topic about relating, about the state of mind, how would you suggest that we talk to other children about our children having ADHD? Because again, without giving private information out, or that child having that label and not wanting others to know, do you have jargon or language that you would suggest? Let's say my 10-year-old son, and he has friends, but he doesn't want them to know he has ADHD. But yet he has trouble communicating, being impulsive, reactive, etc. How would you that jargon and that language to talk to those children and say, do you suggest they say his brain works a little bit different, or what would your suggestions be?
Kind of none of the above. My suggestion really for a lot of these kids, the reason why they love comic books, they love cartoons, they love video games, is because it gives them a sense of empowerment. They can escape their real world life and all of a sudden take on a different persona. And the reason why they tend to do that is because they don't have people in their lives for whom can be role models. So if we don't show them people with ADHD who are like them, who have gone through this stuff, they grow up thinking that this is just happening to them. Where do we fit in the world? So part of why I love doing what I do is because I'm a tangible example of a success story that I can share with these kids. I've been where you've been, and it is hard. It gets better. So by promoting people with ADHD to them, to kind of show them, talk to them about their journey, to normalize things for them. And that's part of the challenge is that, people will say ADHD is what's wrong with me. I challenge that. ADHD is not what's wrong with me. It's actually what's right with me. What's wrong is societal ignorance and people not knowing. And that's not on me. That's on society, right? So I kind of, if we think of the square peg in the round hole, society being the round hole and people with disabilities being the square peg, since the beginning of time, we've tried to shift, contort, and manipulate that square peg to fit through that round hole. That peg is beautiful. It's the hole that needs expanding. We don't need to change that peg. The peg's always been there. It's always going to be there. It's society that needs to change so that then it'll fit. So for me, it's really about promoting positive stories to get kids to understand that there are people out there that they can look up to. And by sharing their stories and normalizing things for them, a great resource that I'll type in the chat for everyone is a website.
So Christelle did type that's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, this is,
I agree too.
This is a lot from my own experience. Like, I'm the example, right? So I've learned all of this stuff from myself of spending, the majority of my life failing to now succeeding and being able to share those experiences with these kids. So I put a website in the chat called differentbrains.org. They actually found me when I first started making these horrible YouTube videos in my basement quite a few years ago, and they sent me a syndication agreement. So at the time when they first started, I think that was one of their first 5 or 10 bloggers or vloggers. Now they're into the hundreds. And like, they've interviewed me, they've interviewed Temple Grandin, they interview individuals who are self-advocates, who are professionals, parents. And so again, there's a lot of positive stories that come from this. Neurodiversity is a huge movement in the States. Like, every Fortune 500 company is looking to implement a neurodiversity hiring program because they know that these kids have unique skill sets that are going to help their business. And that's part of the challenge of being in New Brunswick, is that if it makes sense, we're going to stare at it real hard, and then we're going to run in the opposite direction. It just doesn't seem to, the mentality hasn't really shifted here. And so everything is kind of slow to come, unfortunately. So for a lot of resources that I follow or look at, they're all in the States. So Different Brains, also in the States, they're based out of Florida. They're a great resource for people, and I really encourage people to check them out.
Thanks, Shawn.
No problem. Communication hacks that I really like to share with people is the rule of 2. So for kids with ADHD, if you give them 3 things to do, they're going to come back maybe having done 1, because by the time that conversation, the last word gets said, to them going to actually do what you ask them to do, everything gets jumbled up in their head. So the rule of 2, give them 2 things, have them come back, give them 2 more things, have them come back, 2 more things.
Sorry.
Okay? That's right. Communication should be short and concise and to the point. This is something that takes practice. For a lot of these kids, I'm sure some of you parents will be able to relate to this. A yes is a yes. A maybe is a yes, and a no is a no until it's a yes, because your kids will pester you. It's because that you're not using clear communication, right? Anytime you say no and you give an explanation and you use a slightly different word when you repeat yourself, you've essentially opened up the door for separate conversation, and the kids will create a bit of a smokescreen to turn it into something it's not. Next thing you know, you're on your heels and you agree to something that you had no intention of agreeing to because you were so overwhelmed. So think about what you need to say ahead of time, keep it short and concise. It's okay to tell kids, I need to think about it. Just because somebody asks us a question doesn't mean that we need to give an immediate answer. And if they keep pushing, you could say, if you keep pushing, the answer is just going to be no. But then you have to stick to that. Something else to keep in mind when we talk about like how kids process things, a lot of neurodivergent folks are empaths. And so there are different types of empaths: the emotional empath, intuitive empath, animal empath, plant empath, and earth empath. I self-identify as being an emotional empath and an intuitive empath. And so I'll give you a few examples of each. So for an emotional empath, I can walk into a room and I know the vibe. I feel other people's energy. I also, I don't watch cable TV. I don't watch the news. A few years ago, when I was doing some consulting in Miramichi, I was staying at a hotel. I went down for the continental breakfast. And I learned about these horrific things, like terrorist things that happened. And I remember thinking to myself, why did I just expose myself to that? And it actually set me back. I would put myself there as though I had witnessed this firsthand. And so I relive all of that. So by exposing myself to that, it sets me back. So I limit the type of information that enters this pretty little head of mine. So again, I don't watch cable TV. I don't read the newspaper. I don't watch the news. I don't listen to the radio. It's all negative. I would rather choose to focus my time on things where I feel I can affect positive social change than things I feel that I can't. To me, it's just not a good use of my energy. I'm also an intuitive empath, which means that within moments of observing or talking to someone, I know how authentic and genuine they are. It's a gift. It's also a curse because I can see through people. I pick up on the little things that people say that are lies. And so that's a hard thing to kind of reconcile sometimes. Are they a friend or are they not a friend based on some of the things maybe that they've said or done that don't really line up with how you feel? An example of an animal empath, I have a former client who goes to equine therapy. And the farm or the stable that they go to, there was a really difficult horse. This horse didn't like anybody. And so the first time this client went to the barn, this difficult horse went right up to him and nuzzled him to be pet. So animal empaths often have a deeper connection with animals than they do people. A plant empath is somebody who gets either energized or de-energized based on their surroundings when it comes to plant life. So in the spring, if someone were to go into Scott's nursery where everything is really lush and green, that would actually energize them. Being out in the forest, being out in nature gives them energy. If they were to walk into Scott's nursery, say at the end of the season when things are kind of dying and wilted, that would actually zap the energy from them. So it's just a different way. An earth empath is someone who feels shifts in the earth. And I guess one example of this would be a few years ago when we had, there was a tsunami. I was violently ill. I didn't have the flu. I had no, other than being violently ill, I had no other flu-like symptoms. And so when there are significant events that happen on the earth, it has an impact on people, especially kids. And so when there are things that are happening like in the news, and right now it's a tricky time with what's happening in Ukraine. My daughter is an empath. Talking about anything war-related or violence-related makes her very uncomfortable. And so with this being a topic that comes up regularly at school, it can be really challenging for kids who are empaths to sit there and have to listen to this over and over and over. One kind of easy way to tell that your kid is an emotional empath or an intuitive empath early on is how they react to Disney movies, oddly enough. Because Disney movies, what happens is at the very beginning, a child is separated from a parent or the parent passes away. And so it forces these kids to think about a situation that is not their real life. And so it forces them to conceptualize in their own life what would happen if they were missing from a parent or a parent passed away. And so they become very emotional and very uncomfortable with that because, again, we're forcing them into a scenario that hasn't actually happened and we're getting them to think about that. And that's an uncomfortable place to be. So that's a really good way to recognize that early on.
And Shawn, I just want to add there too that you nailed it with my son, talking about an empath, emotional empath with the Walt Disney movies, etc. And unfortunately, with our population and our participants, though our children have experienced a loss of their bio parents and attachments, right, with that bio family. So it is so true that sometimes my son will say a Walt Disney movie is, quote, scary. And I'll kind of question and go, like, scary, like, you're 10 years old. Like, why do you find this one scary? Not that it's okay to, but it's what he means is it's too emotional. It's scary because in the dinosaur Land Before Time, the dinosaur dad falls and dies, right? So he finds it too scary to watch, right? So it is so true.
And with Finding Nemo, right? Like, people love Nemo, but it's horrible. Really, we kind of dress it up a certain way so that kids will watch it, but it's really not necessarily meant for kids. And it's a tricky thing. Like, kids will also try things on. Like, I can remember when my son was very young and the movie Tangled came out, and he took a plastic frying pan and hit my niece over the head with it, because that's what he saw in the movie, right? So, like, kids will also try things on that are not always appropriate, but because they've seen a cartoon do it, they feel like, oh, okay, well, if that person didn't really get hurt in the movie, then that's, it's okay for me to try on. So it's an interesting thing for sure. The next thing to talk about are reward systems. Reward systems typically don't work. And I went through this as a kid. My parents would offer us money. Well, actually, first of all, so one semester in high school, I went over 4. I failed all 4 classes. I lost everything. My world as I knew it came to a very abrupt end. I couldn't talk on the phone. I couldn't watch TV. I couldn't go out with friends. The only time I could go out driving was when I had to pick up my sister from work and I had to bring her straight home. Like, I had no life. The next semester, I think I passed 1 class. So, like, taking everything away didn't work, right? So when reward systems are built and centered around the fact that people think there's a lack of effort from the child, and that's not the case. This essentially means that they're being penalized or rewarded for something that is completely out of their control. And so my parents went from taking everything away to trying to reward me and my siblings. So I think it started with $25 for every class that we passed. My parents came into money. They sold their business. And so at one point it was up to like $200 a class. It didn't matter. It could have been $1 million. There was no incentive, right? It didn't matter what they took away or how much they offered me. If they weren't providing the help that I needed, none of that mattered. And so essentially what happens from a psychological perspective is when that kid is not able to meet the goal, how do you think they feel? They feel worse. Like, why should I even bother? And if there's a sibling involved and the sibling is able to meet that goal, then they feel even worse. So then the child will actually try to manipulate and find a way to get that reward without actually having earned it. So then what have we taught the kid? That you can be sneaky and cunning and manipulative to get what you need. That's not what we're trying to get across either, right? So reward systems typically don't work. They will work for individuals with intellectual disabilities where their emotional age is usually under 6 or 7. Then they'll typically work. But once they get to a certain age, you can't really pull the wool over their eyes. They're gonna see this. They're gonna notice it. Yeah. So it's just that it's a hard thing to do, and a lot of parents will fall into this trap. And a lot of professionals will recommend a reward system. Again, me being on both sides of it, really doesn't work so well. Punitive versus natural consequences. So a punitive consequence would be that, like, let's say that your son lied to you about something and you take his Xbox away. Well, one thing has nothing to do with the other. So that would be an example of a punitive consequence. So a natural consequence for lying is that he has damaged the relationship and he needs to repair it. In order to repair that, there needs to be some type of reparation. So maybe it's baking you a cake, making you a card, doing a chore that helps you around the house. That makes sense, right? things need to kind of flow. And so a punitive consequences is an authoritative approach that takes things away, and it's punitive and contributes to the person's negative headspace and narrative. These kids are accustomed to losing things, and by taking them away, we inadvertently add ourselves to the long list of people that they don't trust. Consequences should be predicted ahead of time when possible, and the consequences should be specific to the person. Sometimes people will come up with group consequences because they have kids close in age. Kids are unique and they're different. So having an overarching set of rules may not necessarily be fair for everybody involved. To go back to the emotional mind, part of what happens is that when we as parents get frustrated and we need to dole out a consequence, we are up here. Like we're heated, we're elevated, and then we'll dole out a consequence that is too heavy. And then when we've calmed down, we'll lessen that consequence because we realize that we've gone too far. And so we'll lessen that consequence. But essentially what we've done when we go from here to here is we've taught that kid that they don't need to listen to us when we're here. They can't trust us because they know that we're going to change what we said anyway. So why would they bother listening to us? So sometimes parents will inadvertently pick up bad habits like doling out consequences in the moment, which is not helpful because it's going to be an emotionally charged decision. Consequences should be predicted to the kid whenever possible. So, if you're late for bed, the natural consequence is that, you're going to be tired tomorrow, you're going to be sluggish, and it's going to be a hard day. Now, you can tell your kids all of these things. They're going to need to experience them themselves, and you get the satisfaction of saying, I told you so, in a very parental type of way. But it really is about trying to predict things ahead of time. When you don't, it will lead to some trouble.
And Shawn, I'd like, go ahead. You're going to say the comments?
Yeah, so we have a good question in the comment. Melanie said, this has been running through my mind as I listen, and maybe a question for the end. How does trauma background impact the diagnosis and treatment approach?
It's challenging because when I don't know that it necessarily impacts the diagnosis, but the whole idea of a treatment approach again implies that there's something wrong with the person. And I know that Kim had asked me to mention different types of therapies. I really hesitate to do that because a lot of them are centered and based on looking at the behavior as wrong and then trying to modify or change that behavior. And it doesn't work. That's essentially asking the kid to mask and be a different version of themselves to appease people around them. So that means that they can't be their authentic, genuine selves. That's not what we're trying to promote. So really, when it comes down to a lot of this stuff, it's relationship based. When somebody comes into my office for the first time, at the end of the session, I tell them the most important thing is that you get the help that you need. And if that's not for me, it's absolutely okay. Just let me know. I give them an out. It should be more based on the relationship with the person, having a conversation with them. I'll tell people, again, the important thing is that you get the help that you need. If that's not for me, that's okay. I don't take on everybody that calls me. It's very important that I feel like I'm a good fit for them and that I feel like I can help them. I'm a for-profit company. I'm all about money. But if I feel like I can't help a person, then I can't see them and I can't take their money. So, when you think of buying a car, would you buy the first car that you see on the lot? Of course not. So why would you do that with your thoughts and emotions? So it's okay, absolutely okay to call different counselors or therapists and have conversations with them to see if they're going to be a good fit. I honestly, I don't have people I recommend, honestly, because a lot of practitioners and therapists are still focused on this deficit-based mindset of trying to fix what they perceive to be wrong with the person. And it's not that I don't have those types of conversations with clients, but that's not where I start. And when all those things come out, it comes out in an organic manner, instead of it being a barrage of questions where people have to go through all these negative feelings that they've had that just perpetuates that there's another person who doesn't get me. And they'll keep going because they feel like they need to, because it's treatment, and they, their parent or their doctor or whoever said that they should go. But if it's not a good fit, it's not a good fit, right? So it's important to have a pretty decent relationship with the therapist. And also, one of the biggest challenges in the disability community is that we have people without disabilities creating resources and programs for people with disabilities. And so it's a lot of a big marketing ploy. Like when people tell me, parents tell me, they've read all these books and resources, I usually tell them, like, please stop, because I compare a lot of it to fad diets. When you read a book about a fad diet and you try that fad diet, it doesn't work. Do you blame yourself or do you blame the author? You blame yourself. You internalize that. But maybe we should blame the author, right? So if we look at this in a different way, Atkins, the Atkins diet. Anybody know what happened to him? He had a heart attack. This is the guy that told everybody to eat more protein, right? So the difference between thinking and knowing is experience. We have too many people who think they know, but lack the experience to be credible. So just because somebody has a bunch of letters behind their name and they might have the education, it doesn't necessarily mean they have the experience required to help you. So it's okay to ask those types of questions, right? There are a lot of people who, they might say that they specialize in ADHD, but really they've only read a couple of books. So one of the things that I personally would look for is, is there somebody who has some of these shared experiences, who knows what I'm going through, right? And so it's kind of a contextual process. I also know that I'm not everything for everybody. I'm not for everybody, and everybody can't be for me. And that's totally okay too. But again, I go back to the car in the parking lot, call around, have conversations with people. I offer a free 30-minute consult because I want to make sure that they're a good fit for me too, right? So it really is about having that conversation to figure out what their perspective is, what their approach is. Certain words to look out for. I practice positive psychology. And so that really is using an asset-based perspective. And I also identify more as a psychotherapist than I do a counselor. And for people who don't really know the difference between the two, I'll explain. I have a YouTube video that's gone viral. It's got over 11,000 views, and it's on the difference between counseling and psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is a lost art form. And so I use the example of if you're riding a bike and you fall and scrape your knee, the counselor is going to get you cleaned up. They're going to bandage you. They're going to give you the tools, the bandages that you need should you fall again. A psychotherapist is going to explore why you fell off the bike in the first place. So there are people who want tools, who want coping strategies. But again, in asking these types of questions, they don't necessarily understand that coping can be synonymous with masking. So in trying to get people to develop coping skills, we're actually asking them to mask, which means they can't be their genuine, authentic self. So this is where it kind of gets tricky when we talk about different therapeutic techniques, right? So somebody may be really good in a certain field, but if what they're doing is trying to teach somebody coping strategies, which means that they can't be their true, authentic selves, is that actually going to help the person? Not really, right? It might seem like it in the moment, but then all this stuff will come bubbling to the surface later. And that brings me back to a point about, like, with kids processing and being empathic and having senses that are heightened. For a lot of these kids, it's kind of like during the day while they're at school or daycare, wherever they are, it's kind of like a pop bottle that gets shooken up. And then at the end of the day, when they get into the car or when, they get home, it's like that cap comes off and everything just bubbles over and overflows. And you're not really sure where it came from or why it happened. It's just, it does. So it's important to kind of recognize that in kids, that they may need some space. And there's ways to talk to kids. Like sometimes we'll ask questions because we have difficulty with silence. Silence is an art form. So when you're driving home after you pick the kids up from school or daycare and you're asking them how they're doing, put it bluntly, you don't really care. I mean, you do, but you don't. You're more asking because you feel like you should. And we want to fill that silence, because when there's silence, we automatically assume that there's something wrong or there's something bad. The kids are just processing their day. Why can't we let them have that, right? Just because we ask the question doesn't mean that they're necessarily in the headspace to answer. But there are different ways to facilitate conversations without it seeming like we're asking a barrage of questions. So when I was in the States, there was a young man that I worked with who was a ward of the state, and he had to dumpster dive to feed his two younger siblings. And so when he came into care, he was so grateful to have 3 square meals a day that he came up with the idea of doing positives and negatives. So you didn't have to have any negatives, but you had to have at least 2 positives. So what are 2 positive things that happened in your day today? And so my wife and I, when we had our own family much later, we changed it to apples and onions. So you don't have to have any onions, but you have to have at least 2 apples. And so when you go around, we do this around the dinner table at supper time. So it's a way to facilitate a conversation without actually asking a question. Because when you ask a question as a parent, kids can sometimes feel like it's intrusive. And so this is just a way to facilitate a general conversation where you'll learn things from the kids that you otherwise may not have learned. They'll provide information, insight into their day without you having to directly ask, which can be very helpful.
We also have some comment. Christelle shared that with my oldest, this happened all the time. Doesn't matter what I take away, it doesn't change his behavior, which is frustrating when you have family telling you that's how you should do it. And Megan respond, I also experienced this. It doesn't matter what I take away. It doesn't matter. I'm just not sure what else to do. And Christelle respond, I feel the same way, Megan, but for me, it's because of how I grew up. So this is so helpful.
And
That's all the comment that we have.
Like, yeah, a lot of us perpetuate what we're kind of mirroring what we saw as kids, right? And so a lot of it comes back to this whole thing of disrespect. And I always, a lot of times when I start a presentation, I'll say kind of a joke where, everybody has at least, or how does it go? Everybody has at least one. No, it's not how it goes. But anyway, it's just that everybody has an opinion and everybody's going to voice that, right? And the people who are voicing the opinion of, if they were my kid, I'd handle it this way. No, you wouldn't. Shut up. It's not helpful. So often, this is part of the challenge. The people who are closest to you will offer insight that is not helpful. It's not like you're soliciting advice. And this is part of the challenge that, I really would like you to keep in mind is that just because somebody is talking doesn't mean that we want them to fix our problems. Maybe we just want them to hear us. So in the same way that, when you're sharing with your own parents about the challenges you're going through and they're offering advice, think about your kids when they're talking to you. They don't necessarily want you to fix it. They just want to feel heard. And so the way that our minds typically work is that when someone is in distress, our brains go into fix it mode. We don't want that person to go through whatever it is they're going through. We want to help fix that for them. It's not ours to fix. It's theirs. And they may not need it fixed. They might just want us to listen so that it can help them process things and so they can work through them on their own. So it's a tricky thing. And part of it is setting boundaries. I love my dad, but I don't really like him. And I've had some pretty stern conversations with him about language that he's used around my kids. He's old school. He will make comments about different marginalized groups. And I've had to have conversations with him. Listen, you have one job. That's to love your grandkids. If you can't do that, you just let us know and we'll come back a different time. And there have been times when we've had to leave because he's made comments about, different marginalized groups or criticized our parenting when he wasn't much of a parent himself. So like him giving parenting advice is pretty rich because he wasn't really around much. It was more my mom who did everything. So sometimes you need to think about who the message is coming from. What makes them an expert in giving you advice. But it's also hard because they're your family, right? A lot of the times, and they may have difficulty accepting things that are different because it was a different time, right? Like back then, kids with ADHD, they might have been quieter, but it literally is because they were scared, right? It's a different generation. It's a different time. We don't want our kids to be scared of us. We don't want them to fear us. We want them to feel like they can come to us You know, when you think, I always try to get parents to think about like, what were the things that you got into when you were your kid's age? And 9 times out of 10, the stuff that we did when we were their age is far worse than anything they get into. But how we handle it is much different, right?
Yeah, there's another chat there too there, Shawn, and Erica is saying, I find when behaviors are present that are not modified by rewards or consequences, the focus needs to turn to relationship building in order to foster or heal the attachment.
Yeah, it's a lot of this is relationship based. The more activities you can do with your kids, and so this kind of brings up another point for me, is that a lot of kids with ADHD will get involved in something and then drop it. And so parents will get frustrated because we grew up thinking, you know, if I think of all the lies my parents told me, like they told me, and it wasn't that it was intentional. It was based off the future that they thought would be secure for me. So my parents told me if I had a university degree, I would be set. That was a lie. They told me if I was bilingual, I would be set. That's another lie. They told me that I'd have one job and that would be my forever job in my career. Also another lie, right? So we need to really think about the messages that we tell our kids. I make a point of sharing that I've had a lot of different jobs. You know, it's okay to bounce around and to try different things. The best way to experience what you like is to experience what you dislike. And every time you experience something that you dislike, it actually brings you a little bit closer to who you are as a person. And that's okay. You know, when you think about being comfortable, well, before you were comfortable, first you were uncomfortable. So it's just a natural progression of things. But when it comes to hobbies and stuff, I always say, like, fuel their passions. And I use my son as an example. Like, if I never see another Pokemon card, well, I will be so happy. But when he was really young, he was into Pokemon cards and he started collecting them. And this was probably when he was around 4. And so because he was very competitive, he wanted to know what they said. And so we taught him the basics, but he picked it up and taught himself how to read. Like, by 6 years old, he had read the whole Harry Potter series. It was nuts. And so when he started getting into Pokemon, he started reading, and he was just so into it. We would take him to the library to get Pokemon books, and that's really how he taught himself how to read. And then with Pokemon, there's the math component, and so then he started learning how to do math, and a lot of it was self-taught. Like, he was doing Sudoku when he was 7. I still can't touch it. You know, so fuel the passion. If there's something that they're interested in, fuel that as much as possible. And again, I use myself as an example. Like, I know that I have different hobbies and talents, and I'll cycle through them. And so instead of parents feeling like frustrated that their kid never sticks to something, they'll come back to it. They're kind of like seasons. They'll come back around to it. It might be in a slightly different way, but just because they lose interest in something doesn't mean that you get rid of it all. Hang on to it for a while. They'll eventually circle back to it. And that's okay, right? Same with sports. Like, parents will get hung up on, you know, I put my kid in this one sport, and they're going to stick it out all season. If they're miserable, why keep them in there? Like, have them try a bunch of different sports to find the one thing that they like, instead of, you know, being fixated. And I understand from like a financial perspective that may not always be feasible. But if they're struggling in an activity, it doesn't make sense to keep them going when it's torture for everybody, right? So I really try to get people to hone in on their unique skill sets. And, you know, I try to, whatever kids think it seems to be impossible or really distant or far away, I try to connect them with someone who can offer them a different perspective. Like, one of my close friends in Miramichi has an animation studio. He's worked on Family Guy, Caillou, even though I hate that little bugger, Sesame Street, games for every platform you can imagine. I probably sent a dozen families from social development for a free tour of his studio. He'll look at their drawings. He'll offer them free advice. He'll give them swag. He'll give them a little lesson. And the whole concept behind it is to give these kids a window into something that seems like it's impossible to do, but it's not. We have this stuff happening right here, right? So it gives them an idea or a sense of what is possible instead of feeling like these things are so impossible.
Yeah, I like your message, Shawn, that you're saying more or less we need to attune to the children And we're not looking to modify them and their personalities. We need to attune to what is going on in their world. They are unique. They are themselves. They have to feel loved, right? And they have to feel that we accept them for who they are. And sometimes the world isn't ready for that. But as parents, we have to be ready for that. So let's modify our understanding of ADHD. And of course, that's happening tonight. I just wanted to point out that I know that we're almost at our time limit, guys, and we have, about 10 minutes left. I'm going to try and let Shawn get through his slides, and then we're going to open it to a question and answer period.
I'm actually done my slides.
Okay.
So I'm open to any questions people may have.
Okay, so since I'm on my phone, as we all know, my internet was not great tonight. I'm going to see if there's any other questions.
I don't see any questions.
I have a question, Shawn.
There you go.
Is Catherine, who you met earlier. I have almost 18-year-old autistic son with ADHD and understandably anxiety disorder. He is beautiful, kind, empathetic, talented, smart. He struggles with school, with making connections and friends. How do I get him? And you can imagine he has a really bad self-worth and doesn't really think he can do anything with his life. How do I get him to find out that there's more people like him? Because I feel like that's really important for him.
It's a good point, and it's going to be a challenge because you're mom. And so mom, you're supposed to tell your kids that they're handsome or pretty, that
That's what he
smart.
says.
Because if you don't do all these things, then what does that mean, right? That you feel the opposite way, which is not how we want our kids to think of it. So
yeah,
sometimes it needs to come from, and this is like, I get goosebumps because having it validated by an outside source is really what helps boost these kids' confidence, right? So parents can tell them all these things, but when they hear it from someone, I'll just use myself as an example, who's an expert in this field, who's gone through all this stuff. When I see something in them and I communicate that to them, their confidence goes through the roof. And then if they have a particular interest in a particular niche, and I connect them with somebody who can then further validate that. And I'll give you a great example. I have a client who is a ward of the province. And when I first started working with him, he wasn't in high school. He'd been out of high school for 2 years. And the social workers are constantly trying to get him back into school. And so they managed to get him back into school. COVID happened and he managed to graduate. He got into college. But in the 2 years that he had off, he basically taught himself how to hack. And so he got flagged at social development to come work with me because of the type of work that I do. And so because my network is so huge, like it's massive. Like I have a celebrity brand ambassador who's an actor, Eileen Gruba. She's been on Watchmen, CSI Miami, Nick Tuck, Hung, and I can contact her and say, hi, Eileen, I've got a client of mine who has an interest in acting. Would you meet with them for a half hour? And she'll say yes, right? So this one particular kid, I connected with an acquaintance of mine who has his PhD in computer science. I'm sure that everybody has heard of face recognition software. Well, my acquaintance developed weapon recognition software, sold it for millions of dollars to a company in the States. And so I had to meet with my client. After a 45-minute conversation, my acquaintance said, by the time this kid's 20, he's going to be making $250,000 a year. These are not the types of messages that social development is used to hearing. My wife is a social worker. And so for social workers, their primary objective is to put out fires and to make sure that these kids are safe. When it comes to thinking about their future, that isn't so much of their mindset of planning ahead and to see what is possible, because they're so busy and the here and now trying to put out these little fires. So for this particular guy, he got into trouble for hacking some provincial websites. And so the social worker got really frustrated and like lashed out at him. It's like, wrong approach. Like instead of trying to scold this kid, let's figure out how we can get him to use this for good instead of getting in trouble. Let's find a way for him to channel this so that he can turn this into something positive instead of getting into trouble. So it takes having somebody outside of the house that your son can connect with, or the young person can connect with, where they feel validated and heard, because it's that experience of somebody outside the house believing in them that kind of gives them that little boost. And it's not always easy to find that right person.
The challenge is to find that. He's knows everything there is to know about computers and has had his own business on and off since he was 14, fixing them up. But to find those people that give him that, message that there's others like him, because he spent since he's 5 years old going to doctors and them all saying, well, we're here to talk about what's not right. You know what I mean?
I absolutely. And so like for me, the things that come to mind are just like all the different people in my network. Like I have someone in my network who's on the spectrum. He works for Gap and leads a team of about 200 people, right? So like
Wow.
Connecting people to other people to show them tangible examples of success stories makes the difference. It fills in the gap. It gives them a sense of hope that, okay, like, nobody goes from A to C without going through B. My B was shitty. But my experience can help these kids make it less shitty for them, get them connected to people who are tangible examples of success stories. So it gives them something to look forward to. Because without that person that they can identify with and see a version of themselves, there is no version of themselves. And so there's a lot of time spent in their head trying to figure things out because they don't have that tangible thing to work towards. They can't really identify or express what that is. So showing them an example of that goes a long way and supporting them in that process.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have their hand up for a question or would someone like to make a comment? If so, you can take it off mute and go ahead. Again, sorry, I can't see everyone, so I'm just giving time.
No problem.
I'd like to go back for a sec. Oh, you're looking, Catherine?
I'm looking. I don't see, there's no hands up. So.
Okay. I want to go back just for a sec too. I really related to what you said about the food issues. And I never knew that went along with ADHD and, having different textures and sensitivities, etc. And we also know that in trauma, that there tends to be a lot, sometimes of food insecurities and food, quote, issues. So I was sitting down thinking to myself as you were talking, I'm like, I went through this like so many times with my son. And I'm thinking now I should just get him to be our food taste tester, for different meals, or take him to the grocery store and say like, what one do you want to try tonight? I mean, I've tried different ideas, but I never thought to like try and give him that encouragement and that title as a food taster, right? And let him be the judge and not judge him on his taste buds or his palate. And when I say judge him, I don't mean, of course, harshly. I just mean, are you sure you don't like that apple? Like, can't you try it again? Or a banana tomorrow. So I really wasn't aware of some of the stuff that you told me tonight. And I consider myself pretty trauma informed and informed about ADHD. So I thank you for that, Shawn. And I guess before we sign off then, again, if there is any questions or comments, go ahead and write them in the chat or take off mute and, feel free to say them now. But I want to say thank you for giving us that perspective of that it's not what's wrong with our child, right? It's sometimes the school systems aren't able to have their assets or the enough room or the techniques to use, where they're understaffed. Sometimes it's at home where you don't have both parents that are understanding ADHD. And that's why we hold these webinars, right? So I really thank you for your expertise in the field and your approach to it. And if anyone wants to contact Shawn after this, he did put his information up at the beginning, but I do have his information. So please just either send me a private message tomorrow, shoot me off an email, and I can send you his information. And as far as NB adoption goes, I just like to say, go to our website, look when our next support groups are. The end of the month, we have our regional support group. So that'll be coming up next week. Right. So please stay tuned. We have many more resources that we'd love to offer you and the support. So Shawn, did you want to say anything in closing?
Yeah,
Well,
so-
just around the food part that you mentioned, there was something that I had mentioned, like when I talk about having the family meeting, part of that entails like sitting down as a family and picking meals. So for a lot of you, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that your kids ask you what you're going to have to eat multiple times throughout the day. And so what this does in having a family meeting and talking about meal planning is it gives the kids a voice in an area where they otherwise feel like they may not have a voice. And so food security is a big issue. Like kids shouldn't have to worry or wonder about what they're going to eat and when. So by having them involved in the process of picking meals, and sometimes the meals that they may pick may not go together like we think they should go together, and that's okay, because sometimes kids don't really understand why we put some of the crap on their plate that we do, right? So not everything necessarily has to go together, but it empowers them to start thinking about it. And so when we get kids thinking about food, the next step is, is there something that they want to make, depending on how age appropriate it is. My kids started at a very early age, probably 6 and 8. So at 6, my daughter could make any kind of egg that you wanted. And when she first started, she touched her thumb on the pan and didn't burn it very much, but never did it again, right? And my wife and I were there to supervise. My son could make crepes or any kind of pancake out of the Joy of Cooking cookbook. So it's important to kind of start these things at an early age. Also incorporating that into that chores. Chores are a big one. A lot of kids, especially kids with disabilities, and parents will often feel like they need to do things for their kids because it's easier. So doing their laundry for them, making their meals, bringing them supper in their rooms, cleaning their rooms for them, doing their dishes, all of these things. That's a bad move. I work with a lot of parents who are now actually, they feel like prisoners in their own home because they didn't instill these things at an early age with their kids. Their kids have no desire or want to go out into the workforce and actually earn money. And it's a major, major issue. So when I have a conversation with parents about incorporating chores, 2 things that parents normally say is, I don't have $10 to just give my kids. And I don't, it's just easier for me to do it than to ask them to do it. One, nobody said anything about $10, and no one said anything about giving it to them. It's having them earn it. And so my kids, again, my kids started at a very early age. I think they were probably 4 and 6, and their allowance was a toonie a week, and their job was to fold their laundry and make their bed. That's where it started. And then as they got older, it increased a little bit, and so did the expectations, right? So if we don't instill these things in our kids at an early age, they won't learn the value of a dollar. And so what happens is when a kid doesn't learn the value of a dollar, and you go to the dollar store and they ask you to buy this toy that's just a complete and utter piece of crap, you know that it's a piece of junk. You know it's going to break as soon as they get it out of the packaging. You buy it for them because they've annoyed the hell out of you, and you finally break down and say, okay, I'll buy the thing. You give it to them, they open it and it breaks, they blame you because you're the person who bought it for them. When they have to use their own money to buy something and it breaks, they get frustrated with themselves. And when that happens, they will then think a little bit harder about where they want to spend their money because they've experienced regret.
So true.
It gives them, and it also gives them a voice. Like, I'm so proud of my kids. Like when the big fire happened in Fort McMurray, the schools did a fundraiser. It was a Toonie Tuesday where everybody brought a toonie to donate to help with relief for the fire. My kids gave their own money. We didn't give them a toonie. They used their own money from their allowance. They're both involved with 100 Kids Who Care. They used to be. And so for that, they use their own money, right? So it gives them a sense of self-worth that they have money, they have something to look forward to, something to save up for. When there's big ticket items that kids want, we'll usually like strike up a deal. Like for a 6-year-old kid, if they want something that costs $50 or $100, it's not a realistic expectation to think that they're going to earn that with $2 a week. So to come up with something that's proportionately fair. So maybe if it's $50, you need to save $20 and we'll cover the other $30. So to come up with something that's proportionately fair. So maybe if it's $50, you need to save $20 and we'll cover the other $30. So maybe if it's $50, you need to save $20 and we'll cover the other $30. So maybe if it's $50, you need to save $20 and we'll cover the other $30. So maybe if it's $50, you need to save $20 and we'll cover the other $30. So maybe if it's $50, you need to save $20 and we'll cover the other $30. So maybe if it's $50, you need to save $20 and we'll cover the other $30. So maybe if it's $50, you need to save $20 and we'll cover the other $30. So maybe if it's $50, you need to save $20 and we'll cover the other $30. So maybe if it's $50, you need to save $20 and we'll cover the other $30. So maybe if it's $50, you need to save $20 and we'll cover the other $30. So maybe if it's $50, you need to save $20 and we'll cover the other $30. So maybe if it's $50, you need to save $20 so that they have something that they can work towards and earn. Because if the goal is too big or too overarching, they'll give up along the way because they feel like it's unattainable. So as parents, we can kind of help facilitate that. They don't have to save it all or earn it all, but they have to contribute something to it. And they should be able to see incrementally how close they're getting every week by showing and having a conversation with them and instilling that sense of self-worth.
That sounds great, Shawn. I just wanted to say that I want to read these off to you before people are logging out here. And it says, Amanda B says, thank you so much. It was so very informative. And Christelle says, this was very helpful. And Tanya, thank you. Sabrina was, thank you very much. It was so insightful, very insightful. And Jen was saying it was so helpful. You have a lot of really good responses here. Heather DeMerchant says, thank you so much. It was really informative. And Nora says, thanks. It was a great perspective and love your approach. Gave me a lot to think about. Megan says, you make some really good points that are so thought-provoking. We'll definitely be starting them family meetings. So I want to make sure to say thank you again, Shawn, and that we'll have your information ready if anyone asks for it. And I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. And I hope everyone has a great night. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks for attending. I really appreciate it. And thanks for the opportunity.
You're welcome.